The morning began like any other, quiet and predictable, until Derek opened his front gate and spotted a bold sheet of paper slapped across his fence. The lettering screamed at him in all caps as though it had been designed to humiliate as much as to inform, "Take down your gate or pay $50 a day." It wasn't written like a polite request. It read like a criminal indictment, as if his neatly framed entry, something that had stood for years without issue, had suddenly transformed into an outrageous obstruction to civilization. His stomach turned, then hardened into irritation. The HOA had given him 72 hours, a ticking time bomb taped to his property, threatening not just money but his dignity. He tore the page off and held it in his hand, the paper crinkling under his grip, wondering if the neighbors watching from behind curtains were smirking at his supposed comeuppance. The language of the notice was razor-sharp. It accused him of blocking a public path, of cutting off rightful access to some shared amenity. It even listed fines, $50 a day, stacked like sandbags ready to bury him in debt. He laughed bitterly at that. Fines higher than my coffee bill, but about as empty as the cups when they're drunk, he thought. The surreal part? He had been using that very strip of land, walking it daily for 8 straight years without a single whisper of complaint. Suddenly, out of nowhere, it was a violation so dire they plastered a scarlet notice against his gate. The suddenness felt unnatural, like a trap that had been waiting for the right moment to spring. And he had a sneaking suspicion he knew whose hand pressed the spring. During the prior night's HOA meeting, President Cynthia Drake had sat smugly over maps, pointing too quickly, smiling too tightly. Her voice carried a hint of something more than concern for rules. Power. It hadn't felt like neighborhood management so much as an ambush cloaked in bylaws. Standing on the porch, the paper still in his fist, Derek flinched at movement from next door. His neighbor, Holly Turner, hurried over in a morning robe, her face tight with worry. Her little girl trailed behind, still wiping the sleep from her eyes. Holly's voice trembled with that blend of curiosity and fear only neighbors embroiled in HOA spats can summon. "Derek, do they really have the right to fine you?" The question carried genuine fear, not just for him, but for herself. Holly was a single mother, and the idea of battling against the neighborhood police force shook her nerves. She couldn't afford the kind of attention Derek was receiving. Derek forced a grin, more to calm her than because he actually felt anything close to amusement. "They think they do," he told her, raising the paper like a bad magic trick gone wrong. "But authority isn't ink. It belongs only where the law puts it." He could see Holly's shoulders sag slightly in relief, though the worry still clung to her features. Her daughter clutched her sleeve and whispered something. Then, in the blunt innocence of children, the girl pointed to Derek's gate and asked, "Why do the angry people want to break the nice door?" The simplicity of that question struck him harder than the HOA notice itself. Why indeed? Kids always cut straight to the truth. Adults were complicating something that had been fine for years. Inside, Derek spread the notice across his counter like evidence. He already knew one key thing. The HOA's authority was limited. They could regulate common grounds, amenities, and shared property. But this strip? This strip was beyond their reach unless there were county documents proving otherwise. And Derek had seen enough paperwork in his professional life to know a bluff when he smelled one. Still, the tone of the notice unsettled him. It wasn't written like a cautious inquiry. It was aggressive, cornering, daring him to resist. Someone wanted this fight. As he sipped his coffee, Derek replayed the board meeting in his head. Cynthia Drake had hovered over plat maps with the determination of a general planning an invasion. Her allies had nodded, eager to rubber-stamp decisions handed to them. And now this aggressive notice had appeared less than 24 hours after her display. Coincidence? Hardly. He wasn't gullible enough to believe this was just about a gate. Cynthia had something larger in mind. By noon, Derek could already feel the pressure building. Neighbors passed on the sidewalk, slowing their steps, glancing at him with something between sympathy and voyeurism. 2 even filmed him from their porches, phones in hand, as if his private conflict had become neighborhood sport. He met their cameras with a smirk louder than words. "Yes, I've read it. Yes, I know what it says. And no, it doesn't scare me." Back inside, he stacked a notepad next to the notice and began a checklist. County acceptance log, subdivision plat stamps, maintenance records. 3 simple keys that determined if a patch of land belonged to the public or remained private. If the HOA was bluffing, The entire attempt would collapse once real records came to light, and something told him he'd find pages as blank as their justifications. Still, a knot gnawed at his stomach. The aggressiveness, the timing, the watching neighbors. It all felt too coordinated, too personal. As evening fell, Derek stood at the gate again, staring at the crumpled paper notice in his hand. The barrier fluttered in the cool air, solid, harmless. Yet the HOA called it a crime. He smoothed the paper out once more, scanning the words, and the confident, pushing tone struck him anew. This wasn't about community harmony. It was about power, masking greed. The clock ticked. 72 hours. And Derek could already sense this wasn't just the start of a violation battle. This was a drumbeat leading to something deeper. By the next morning, Derek was more energized than usual. The notice, still pinned flat on his counter, didn't glare at him with intimidation anymore. It looked like a puzzle waiting to be solved. He had dealt with faceless bureaucracy before and knew rules only held weight when backed by real documents. Ink without law was just theater, and Derek was ready to pull back the HOA's curtain. He opened his notebook where the checklist sat neatly written: County Acceptance Log, Subdivision Plat Stamp, Maintenance Map. 3 things. 3 keys to decide if this so-called public path was ever actually public. He reminded himself that emotion doesn't win fights like this. Evidence does. After brewing his coffee, Derek took a short ride downtown to the county courthouse. The building smelled faintly of dust, paper, and the kind of bureaucracy that collects like cobwebs over decades. A clerk behind the counter looked up from her desk with a polite but weary face. Derek explained calmly but firmly that he wanted to see specific road acceptance records attached to his subdivision address. The clerk, unfazed, pulled a heavy binder from the archives and flipped to the relevant section. The pages fanned out, creaking from disuse. Derek leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the sight that confirmed his suspicions. Blank lines. 0 signatures. No commissioner approvals. No engineer marks. Not even a penciled ghost date. The page stood empty, like a gradebook where no student had ever shown up. He felt the kind of satisfaction that bubbles not as triumph but as clarity. So nobody ever formally accepted this as a county road? He asked. The clerk shook her head and pointed to the maintenance map hanging on the wall. If it wasn't in the log, it wasn't maintained. Derek snapped photos of the blank ledger and the map, each click crisp with vindication. On his way home from the courthouse, pride lightened Derek's steps, but a knot of unease remained twisted in his stomach. Yes, the evidence was in his favor. But the HOA hadn't moved this aggressively for nothing. He thought of Cynthia Drake, the HOA president. For years she had paraded around board meetings with the steely calm of someone who loved rules less for order than for power. If she was pushing this, she likely had a deeper play. Still, Derek held the advantage of truth, the ground itself, with paperwork to back it up. That afternoon, he rang Clara Benson. Clara was more than just a land surveyor. She was a consummate professional Derek had leaned on before in his insurance work. Tough, sharp, pragmatic. The kind of woman who would call out a crooked line faster than an attorney red-penning a contract. Clara, I need you for a property line dispute. It's about whether a strip of land is actually public. She didn't hesitate. Agreed to bring her transit equipment the following morning. Relief simmered as Derek hung up. Professional evidence, not just his word, would nail this fence line shut in the court of logic. That evening, he walked Holly through what he had uncovered. She stood in her robe again, still managing her worry, as Derek showed her the photos of the county log. Pages that looked more like a diary abandoned before it started. Holly's eyes widened as understanding clicked in. What the HOA had framed as righteous punishment was just smoke. So there's no record at all? Then they can't fine you, she whispered. Derek nodded firmly. Exactly. HOA manages community land they own, or roads formally accepted by the county. This strip? It's neither. It's private property with utility easement, nothing more. Her daughter tugged at her sleeve again, eyeing Derek curiously. This time she didn't ask directly, but her stare carried the innocence of truth. Why would adults bully a neighbor when the rules clearly said otherwise? Derek's heart warmed at her honesty. At least someone, however young, could still see clarity without agenda. Inside his house, Derek expanded his investigation. He reviewed the subdivision plat again, tracing the thin lines across its faded paper. Sure enough, Those lines marked the strip only as utility and drainage, not as public right-of-way. Pipes underground are one thing, he thought. Pedestrians and roads are another. Bureaucrats knew the difference, even if Cynthia pretended not to. His grin widened with every flick of evidence piling against the HOA's claim. But the more he uncovered, the sharper the puzzle became. If Cynthia knew, or should have known, that the county never accepted the land, why issue a violation letter with such confident authority? Derek knew HOA presidents made mistakes, but the cold, legalistic language of the notice was too deliberate, too cocky. People who bluff usually leave wiggle room, hoping fear will do the work. This notice had cut like a blade, certain in its narrative. That certainty, Derek suspected, wasn't ignorance, it was disguise. Someone had to be hiding a motive. By nightfall, Derek spread his evidence across the table in the glow of a single lamp. The notice, the county ledger photos, his notes. Tomorrow, Clara would bring the weight of professional surveying, staking the ground as permanent proof. He ran his hand along the edge of the table, feeling the tension beneath his calm face. He wasn't just defending a gate. He was uncovering something deeper, and the paper barrier Cynthia had posted on his fence was about to face the unforgiving weight of real, documented truth. The next day should have brought Derek peace of mind. Clara arrived bright and early with her transit equipment, the kind of gear that didn't bend to opinions, only to measurements. Together they carried the tripod, stakes, and rods to the disputed strip, while the morning air turned crisp enough to see their breath. Holly appeared again, this time armed with her phone, snapping photos of every angle. Derek wanted everything recorded. Watching Clara align her scope, mark the ground with orange paint, and hammer the wooden stakes into place felt grounding, as though the land itself was finally speaking with authority. Numbers don't lie, she declared, clipboard in hand. The survey revealed exactly what Derek suspected. The barrier sat on his property, secured snugly within his parcel, with extra space to spare. No encroachment, no trespass, only private land held upright by a barrier built years ago. Derek should have exhaled in relief and moved on with his day. But that was when Cynthia Drake stormed into the scene. She marched across the grass as if every blade bent to her shoes, clutching a swollen binder crammed with documents. Her voice was sharp before her shadow even reached them. CCR Section 12.4 covers all pathways in our development, she announced, as though the words themselves closed the case. Derek raised an eyebrow, his pen halting mid-note, then looked straight at Clara. CCR can't pave reality, Cynthia. Only county seals give birth to roads. Clara, professional to the core, examined the sheet Cynthia held out, a subdivision plat. Her trained finger pointed to the line etched across it. 10F'd utility drainage easement. Clear as day. Not roadway, not public path. The phrase utility glowed like a legal dagger cutting through Cynthia's performance. Drainage for pipes was never an invitation for joggers. For a moment, Cynthia faltered. Her confident posture cracked around the edges. She flipped desperately through more pages, searching for anything to prop her position. If it were public, the county would maintain it, Holly interjected bluntly, holding her camera steady. Derek seized the moment, pulling photos from his phone. Blank pages where roads should have been listed, acceptance ledgers empty. It was like a ghost classroom, no signatures, no attendance, no acceptance. Nothing. Clara tallied her final measurements, handing Derek a clipboard with results. Proof undeniable. Still, Cynthia bristled, insisting with quivering authority. The board voted unanimously to enforce this violation. Derek smiled faintly. And your board could vote unanimously that shadows are brick walls. Doesn't make it true. Holly laughed quietly, feeding Cynthia's irritation further. Eventually, she stormed away, papers flapping like loose sails in a storm. Derek expected silence to follow, victory echoing in the wake. What arrived instead was escalation. That afternoon, an envelope sat in his mailbox, stamped in aggressive red, urgent property lien notice. His stomach sank as he tore it open. The letter, signed by all 5 HOA board members, threatened to record a lien against his deed for non-compliance, locking his house and title in bureaucratic chains. Derek read aloud in his kitchen, his voice dripping with disbelief. Failure to remove entry. Line scheduled after 72 hours. He wasn't staring at rational governance anymore. He was staring at open warfare. Lions meant banks, property value attacks, credit damage, bigger stakes than any fence. This wasn't law anymore. It was intimidation turned weapon. As Derek processed the escalation, yet another blow landed the following morning. A furious knock rattled his door. Holly, disheveled in pajamas, stood outside pointing toward the disputed strip. Derek followed her and froze. The straight lines Clara had marked yesterday now rippled into crooked angles. All 4 wooden stakes had been yanked and shoved several feet from their original position. Fresh dirt mounded around them, the scars of tampering obvious. A survey is cold science, but this was sabotage. Someone had crept onto his property in the night to vandalize legal evidence. Holly snapped photos immediately, capturing the fresh holes where the markers had been, the sloppiness of the crime. Derek clenched his jaw. They thought moving a stake could erase 2 decades of records etched into public archives. To him, it only screamed desperation, a cornered animal clawing at its cage. He phoned Clara right away. Within an hour, she drove up, her lips pressed thin with disgust. "Tampering with survey stakes is a misdemeanor," she said flatly while hammering replacement markers back into the ground. "This isn't just shady. It's a crime in the state code." Her tape measure clicked firmly as she recalibrated the lines, remarking how permanent surveys were like treasure maps, once drawn, forever valid. Neighbors gathered nearby, filming, whispering, eyes wide at the escalation. Now it wasn't just Derek witnessing HOA overreach. The whole block was watching as lines in the dirt became battle lines. That afternoon, Clara dropped a heavier revelation. While researching subdivision records further, she discovered Cynthia herself had filed a personal request with the county 6 months earlier. The request sought a special exception to convert that strip of land into an HOA amenity trail. Derek felt cold all over as she explained. "Amenity trails raise property values, especially for homes adjoining them," Clara said quietly. Derek's mind connected the flashes. Cynthia owned several rentals backing onto that strip. If she could sell the idea of a trail, her rents would surge. The HOA's threats, the dramatic notice, the theater, it hadn't been about community rules. It had been a personal profit scheme wrapped in bylaws. Derek stared at his gate that evening, the barrier now glowing neon in his mind. It wasn't wood and iron anymore. It was his last defense against manipulation. Cynthia wanted to tear it down not for neighbors or safety, but for her pocketbook. He sipped his coffee, calm but searing with fury. Every move she made twisted the HOA's claim from clumsy bluff to malicious scheme. They wanted control. He wanted truth. And between the two now lay proof of sabotage, broken trust, and an incoming firestorm. After days of threats, sabotage, and half-truths, Derek realized defense alone wouldn't stop this storm. The HOA had already escalated beyond reason, openly tampering with survey stakes, threatening liens, and doubling down on authority they didn't have. If he simply kept warding off blows, Cynthia would find another tactic to corner him. It was time to flip the board. Sitting at his dining table late one evening, Derek stared at the pile of county documents and Clara's survey results. Every paper screamed the same truth. The land in dispute wasn't a public path, wasn't HOA common ground. It was nothing but a paper strip, the ghost of a temporary construction easement long expired. Then, almost buried in one of Clara's late-night calls, came the revelation that struck him like lightning. The county had actually listed the strip in its surplus property files. They didn't want it, they'd never accepted it, and they were actively seeking to sell it off. For the county, it was dead weight. For Derek, it was an opportunity wrapped in legal ribbon. The next morning, Derek made the call. The county surplus office explained the sealed bid process with all the detachment of bureaucrats accustomed to shuffling parcels no one really wanted. "Minimum bid is $500, the clerk said. "Highest bidder gets it. Sealed envelope, cashier's check, deadline Friday at 5 p.m. Derek's lips curved into a grin. He didn't just want to stop the HOA. He wanted to own the ground beneath their threats. Owning private title would transform every violation letter into toilet paper. For once, silence and paperwork would scream louder than Cynthia's voice. Still, Derek wasn't reckless. Clara, pragmatic as always, urged him to lock down details with his back neighbor first. "If you're going to buy the strip, you need crystal clear boundaries. Let's draft a boundary line agreement. Sign it, stake it, and file it before your bid." It was solid advice. That afternoon, Derek sat with his back neighbor, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in the subdivision longer than most. Over coffee and Clara's maps, the neighbor nodded knowingly. He remembered, in fact, when construction crews had used the easement years ago. It was supposed to be temporary, he muttered. They were going to restore it back. Within an hour, they had signed papers verifying property integrity in advance, preventing any fresh boundary disputes from sprouting after the purchase. It was neat, responsible, and unassailably legal. Friday arrived heavy with anticipation. Derek held the manila envelope with his offer tucked neatly inside. $2,000, 4 times the minimum bid. Not because he needed to overpay, but because he wanted certainty. Let no rival bidder sneak in under him. He included a cashier's check, notarized forms, every scrap of documentation that would remove ambiguity. As he sealed the envelope, his hands trembled just slightly, like someone who knew he was clutching dynamite. If this landed, the entire fight would collapse like a deck of cards. He whispered to himself, one chance to end this properly, before sliding it across the clerk's desk. The weekend stretched out like an eternity. Derek watched Cynthia's smug letters continue to arrive. Another lean threat, another aggressive slip folded into his mailbox like weapons disguised as paper. But for once they didn't rattle him. He knew something she didn't. Her entire scheme was resting on land she neither owned nor governed, and soon Derek would own it himself beyond dispute. Monday morning, the call came. Mr. Lawson, congratulations. You submitted the winning bid for parcel number 478921. Derek set his coffee cup down so carefully, his hands shaking, not with fear but with electric relief. In one clean stroke, $2,000 and a sealed envelope, he had eliminated the HOA's entire legal foundation. Ownership trumped every violation threat, every fine, every letter. Now the strip wasn't a gray zone of dispute. It was his clear private title stamped by the county itself. Clara helped with the next step, merging the strip into Derek's existing parcel. Piece by piece, they prepared paperwork for what was called a boundary merger deed, locking the two properties into one permanent record. Think Lego blocks, she smiled. Once you snap them together, no one can pull them apart. The merger would wipe away any chance of future HOA tricks or neighbor doubts. Derek grinned at the metaphor. He wasn't just winning. He was re-engineering the game board so his opponents no longer had any place to play. That evening, he walked to the gate, listening to the breeze flutter through the trees as he traced his hand along the iron frame. Yesterday, it had been a barrier under siege. Today, it was land fortified by a deed. He knew Cynthia hadn't yet processed the reality. She would scream, she would threaten, but none of it mattered. A county seal carried more weight than 100 HOA meetings. The decisive blow came the following day. As expected, Cynthia called, her voice sharpened with fury, demanding compliance with the latest deadline. Derek paused for dramatic effect before replying. Cynthia, I thought you should know. As of this morning, I own the land you keep threatening me over. The county deed is in my hand. Silence stretched on the line. So long Derek could almost hear her blood pressure rising. Finally she sputtered, Impossible! You can't just buy public land. Derek laughed low, steady. You're right. And that's why the county sold it to me. Because it was never public in the first place. When he hung up, Derek didn't feel adrenaline, only calm resolve. The merger deed was being filed. The fence and barrier weren't temporary shields anymore. They were cornerstones of privately owned land. For the first time since the HOA ambush began, Derek wasn't just defending his property. He had captured theirs. And with county law behind him and neighbors slowly learning the truth, Cynthia's empire of paper threats had quietly crumbled in a single elegant move: the purchase. The moment Derek officially picked up the deed papers from the county recorder's office, the battle lines that Cynthia Drake had drawn evaporated. The courthouse echoed with the clerk's monotone voice as she read off the official entry. Deed number 2024, Chait 1749, recorded this day, parcel merger complete. These words didn't sound dramatic to the room full of clerks, but to Derek they carried more weight than every HOA letter stacked against him. With that stamp, the disputed strip was no longer a question mark on the subdivision plat nor a toy for Cynthia's ambitions. It was now his, fused legally into his property like steel welded in place. When Derek stepped outside, sunlight hit the embossed seal like a metal pinned on his chest. For the first time since the ugly notice had been taped to his fence, his shoulders fell in relief. This wasn't defense anymore. This was victory documented in black ink on white paper, filed in public records where even the loudest HOA tantrum couldn't reach. Yet he knew the storm hadn't passed completely. Cynthia was never the type to surrender quietly. She had escalated through notices, liens, vandalism of survey stakes, even legal intimidation. She would fight to her last shred of pride. And sure enough, the escalation came quick. A White County truck rolled into the subdivision the following morning, carrying an inspector with a clipboard, followed minutes later by Cynthia herself. Binder in hand and highlighter marks cutting through her photocopied maps, she began her usual speech about emergency access and public safety. Only this time, she was pacing in front of Derek's barrier under the critical eyes of a county code enforcement officer, Mike Rodriguez. Neighbors trickled outside, forming a hushed semicircle, eager for the showdown they'd been waiting weeks to witness. Derek leaned on his gate, arms crossed, letting reality speak for itself. "Do you have the county acceptance ordinance number for this roadway?" Mike asked firmly, scanning Cynthia's papers. Her mouth opened, then closed again as she shuffled through diagrams that looked more childish the longer she held them. "We don't operate on crayons and HOA votes, ma'am," Mike said dryly, pulling out his county database. He tapped Derek's parcel address, cross-checked utilities and rights-of-way, then shook his head. "No ordinance, no acceptance, no record. This is private property with a utility easement. That's all." A murmur rippled across the crowd as phones lifted, catching her paralysis frame by frame. Derek added softly, loud enough for neighbors, "Maybe she thinks HOA board meetings create county law." Even the inspector fought back a smirk. To make the judgment airtight, the county traffic engineer arrived with his oversized truck to test alternate emergency routes. He drove the vehicle through Derek's secondary pathway, wheels crunching over gravel, turning radii measured, clearance confirmed. Everything complied with county fire codes. Mike noted it clearly in his checklist. Emergency access requirements met. No violation. Those words cracked Cynthia's last weapon, her safety argument, clean in half. But then came the revelation that shook the entire neighborhood awake. Mike mentioned, almost casually, that their office had a record of a policy exception request for a trail conversion, submitted 6 months earlier. He read the applicant's name out, Cynthia Drake. Gasps spread through the gathered neighbors. Phones clicked, recording as faces turned toward her in disbelief. For weeks she had insisted this was about rules, safety, and regulations. But in reality she had been maneuvering for her own financial gain. Cynthia owned rental homes near the disputed strip, and as Clara had predicted, converting it to an HOA amenity trail would have raised their value. What had been framed as selfless community enforcement now dissolved into selfish real estate scheming. By evening, the HOA called an emergency board meeting. Derek attended, this time not as a defendant but as a quiet observer. The 4 remaining board members confronted Cynthia with the county's report in front of a packed clubhouse audience. Questions turned into accusations and accusations into demands. Finally, when the vote was called, the tally stood unanimous. No confidence removal effective immediately. Cynthia sat frozen, binder limp in her lap, as the board's decision echoed in the silence. Keys, codes, and community documents were stripped from her authority. Her downfall didn't end there. Within days, a financial audit revealed that Cynthia had diverted HOA funds into studies supporting her imaginary trail. Misuse of community money piled onto her problems like weights on a sinking ship. The state HOA Oversight Board opened an inquiry into abuse of authority, conflict of interest, and threats without legal jurisdiction. What had been whispers in the neighborhood hardened into official investigations carrying restitution demands and potential penalties. The very network she had manipulated to build her influence now pressed down on her with full force. Meanwhile, Derek's property entered a new chapter. Clara installed sturdy steel bollards at each property corner, painted bright yellow with reflective markers. A Knox box was affixed for emergency services, satisfying every conceivable fire code or county requirement. The fire marshal, Alan Brooks, conducted his inspection and signed a crisp approval letter confirming compliance. His words carried more finality than any HOA bluff could ever muster. No violations. Property secured. Access routes compliant. Derek accepted the signed form with a quiet smile, knowing it was the final lock in a vault no HOA hand could pry open. The following week, Derek placed a custom sign on one of the bollards. It read simply, "Private property, Deed number 2024-08-1749. No need for shouting, no bitter slogans, just the quiet authority of deed and law. Neighbors gathered, some clapping softly, others shaking his hand. Even Holly's little girl cheered, tugging at her mother's sleeve before saying loudly, "The nice gate stays." Derek crouched beside her, smiling. "Yes," he said. "Sometimes grown-ups forget, but the truth always stands up in the end." From his back porch that evening, coffee in one hand, the faint sunlight glinting off the new steel posts, Derek exhaled the stress that had clasped his chest for weeks. What began as a humiliating notice taped to his entry had ended with victory by patience, evidence, and persistence. Cynthia's reign had collapsed under its own greed, and the community had learned the difference between leadership and tyranny. In the end, Derek hadn't just protected his barrier. He had affirmed something bigger, that paperwork and persistence can outlast intimidation, and when truth holds the deed, no amount of noise can move the fence.